Hello and welcome to Mint and Burn, the academic analysis of blockchain and other technologies in the decentralized digital economy. I'm your host, Kelsie Nabben, and we're tuning in remotely from the RMIT University Blockchain Innovation Hub to bring you interesting guests, publications, and experts to test frontier ideas in these critical and emerging industries. This is episode number 2 of Mint and Burn, and today we will be talking to Dr. Thibault Schrepel, a Stanford University faculty associate and assistant professor at Utrecht University, along with the RMIT Blockchain Innovation Hub resident expert, Dr. Aaron Lane, who also lectures in competition law in RMIT's graduate school. Our topic today is blockchain code as antitrust law. Thibault, Aaron, welcome.
Thank you.
To be here.
So Thibault, let's start by talking about your background as a lawyer and what got you interested in blockchain to eventually write the fairly well-known paper, Blockchain Code as Antitrust Law.
Sure, thank you. So my background is a fairly classic background, I guess. I got a PhD, I went to law school, I got a PhD in law, in antitrust law, and most specifically my dissertation was about something that I labeled predatory innovation. So this is a practice when digital companies modify a product that they have already on the market, not to improve the product, but to eliminate competition. And so I've decided actually in the PhD to integrate 2 or 3 paragraphs discussing blockchain, although at the time it was really, it was the very beginning of it. And in any case, I knew almost nothing about blockchain, but I just thought, well, if it becomes something, it will be great to have those 2 paragraphs. And I believe that it got the attention of a few persons, especially in Europe. And on that basis, I've been invited to the OECD, to the first roundtable on the subject of blockchain and antitrust. And so I've decided that I had no choice but to spend literally days and nights and weekends working on blockchain. And I remember drafting a list of 30 questions that I had, reading all the papers that I could. And I sent those questions to a few persons in the field. And every time I got the same answer, I thought to myself, well, this has to be true, or at least for now, I will consider the thing to be true. And so I got my understanding of the field that way. And since then, it has become a real brain virus. I know I shouldn't use the word virus anymore, but still, it is all I think about. And even outside my scholarship, if I walk in the streets, I will think, well, what if that thing will be on a blockchain? What will be the difference? So this has been the path in the field, I guess.
So I'm curious about how you see the relationship between law and code. And then maybe, Aaron, you can jump in after Thibault on this. But many people have heard Lawrence Lessig's, also a lawyer's, phrase around code is law. And you say that blockchain and antitrust law both pursue decentralization in that antitrust punishes anti-competitive practices and prevents harmful concentrations, while blockchain implements decentralization in its core functioning. So it seems like you're viewing blockchain as a more kind of proactive and productive mechanism, I guess, to approach decentralization. Would that be true?
So it's true that in that paper that I co-authored with Vitalik Buterin, we start from the premise of Lawrence Lessig and the idea indeed that code is law. I'm sure everyone have heard about that so many times. Actually, the book is freely accessible in open access, and I recommend everyone to have a read. And you see that it's actually a bit more complex than just the idea of the code should become the law. It's not really the idea. The idea is to say that the way we design digital stuff will actually change the behaviors of people. And so we start from that premise, and on top of that, since indeed code is law, our idea is to say that both antitrust and blockchain should be proactive. So when it comes to antitrust, it means being proactive in punishing certain anti-competitive practices, especially those which are targeting the code. And when it comes to blockchain, it means being proactive by designing blockchain in a certain way, since again, the idea is that code is law. So in the end, we argue that both of their objective, antitrust and blockchain, is to eliminate coercive economic power. And that you could call it decentralization, but it's not decentralization for the sake of it. And that also is true for blockchain and antitrust. It's not a result that we should achieve at any cost. The idea is that it should be the means on top of and a way for us to build our economic relationships in our society. So this has been the idea of the paper, but I think if you take a step back to leave just a little bit antitrust and blockchain, I think the relationship between the law and the code is changing. And I think this is really interesting. Historically, and especially for us lawyers, we were trained with the idea that the law should be the number one constraint on our society, right? That's what we've been told. The rule of law, it works quite well, and we should protect that at any cost. And our idea also for the paper, and the reason why we've decided to write this paper, was to have a look around and potentially to think that the technology, or if you want to call it code, you can, is actually gaining ground as being a very important constraint that organizes our society as well. And we see that. I mean, we are doing this podcast. It's not a secret, using softwares and computers, and it's not a thing in person. So we rely on software in a sense. And of course, that's the famous, sentence, software is eating the world. But I think it is becoming more and more relevant. And it means that if eventually code is organizing our societies, it will become a constraint that is very important, and potentially to think that we should apply the law no matter what could work, it would work. But our idea is to say that if the law and code could be combined, then potentially we could achieve the common good in an even better way. So that's the general perspective of the paper. And of course, we applied that to antitrust and blockchain, as I just mentioned.
Aaron, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of things to unpack there. I think we could take up a lot of time. I know, Kelsie, you've put a lot of thought into where you want this conversation to go, but I'm going to derail it slightly by just stepping back a few paces and unpacking a little bit this idea of law as code. I guess what predates Lessig's work was was an article that he wrote really in response to another article that was written by an American judge called Frank Easterbrook. And Easterbrook was talking about the law of the horse as kind of a metaphor for talking about the law of the internet. And what Easterbrook was saying is, there's no law of the horse. We don't teach the law of the horse when you go to law school. So this idea of teaching the law of the internet or cyber law is kind of a dumb thing to do. And Lessig, I guess, came along and said, okay, yeah, that's true, but looking at the law of the horse might actually teach us something about the horse. And that was kind of the genesis of that. It was kind of saying, well, yeah, okay, I get the point, but in looking at this idea of law as code, or looking at the idea of the law of the internet, it might actually teach us something about the law itself. And I think that was, Thibault, that's kind of what you were getting at there, was this idea of code as being one way of being able to control behavior when we're talking about antitrust law, or competition law is probably more commonly known in the EU and certainly in Australia. This idea of being able to control competitive behavior or commercial behavior through code rather than through the other mechanisms. So that the other thing sort of Lessig is famous for is what he calls this pathetic dot theory, which I think is a stupid name, but he created it, so he can call it whatever he wants. But it's this idea that law is a controlling force, that the market is a controlling force, that social norms are a controlling force, that architecture, or in this case software architecture and code being a controlling force. And so I think that I just want to sort of unpack that a little bit for listeners out there that might not have come into contact that before, but absolutely, as Thibault said, it's accessible in the sense that it's kind of free, open access. It's also an accessible work in the sense it's easy to read. It's written not in a traditional academic style. It's very zany, kind of a book to read with quite colorful examples, and so yeah, highly recommend kind of that history, because I think what Thibault and Vitalik are doing here is tapping in to really a long history of legal thought here, which is super, super interesting.
And if I may, first of all, I have to confess that it's probably the best, or at least my favorite, let me put it this way, my favorite legal book that I've ever read. So of course it is highly influential on my thinking. I also have to say, and recently I've listed my 3 favorite articles ever written in the field of antitrust. And the first one that I've listed is actually the paper that you mentioned, the one written by Judge Easterbrook, because I think it's also great. And the idea in the paper, as he explains, that we do not necessarily need specific laws to tackle the horse or the internet, I think is very powerful. And here again, I mean, what we're doing in the paper with Vitalik is that we are discussing code and blockchain, but at the end of the day, our intention is that to apply antitrust as we know it since, the end of the 19th century should be the idea. So I think it's actually the two, Lessig and Easterbrook, could be combined in a way, and that's what we tried to do with this paper. But again, I mean, I concur fully. It's a great read. And it's also very interesting because when Lessig is discussing architecture, it is also giving examples about architecture in the real space and explaining that the city of Paris, to some degree, has been designed so that it will be easy for the police to enter the streets in case of a second revolution. And it will be easier to contain if the city was designed in a certain way. And that's the analogy to the digital space, I think, is very powerful. So I think probably we have to leave the subject, but it's a fascinating subject. So to anyone out there, it's 100% recommended.
So if the shape of society is shifting around digital technologies, and I know in the blockchain hub, we kind of talk about the digital economy and the kind of reality, especially, post-COVID, that it's very much here as our everyday infrastructure. What does that transition look like, do you think, where code, the technology you're talking about, blockchain, kind of supplements the law and vice versa? Sure.
So again, the idea of the paper is to say that none of them, either blockchain or antitrust, are self-sufficient. When it comes to antitrust, we have the numbers, so it's quite easy. We know that antitrust agencies detect, and I guess that's pretty much true all over the world, they detect between 10 and 15% of anti-competitive practices, which means that 90% got undetected. So I mean, great for the 10%, but is it all we can do? We don't think so. And potentially their code will be a way, not of course to eliminate all anti-competitive practices. That will be probably a dystopia. And if you've watched the movie Minority Report, you know that it doesn't end well. So that's not the idea, but still for those 90% transactions, if they are taking place on top of an architecture which seeks to eliminate coercive economic power, we believe that the common good will be improved. And when it comes to blockchain, we also see that it's not perfect. And the idea that there is no pilot in the cockpit, because I mean, you could put it in two different ways. On the blockchain, I know it's in theory, in practice it's not the same, but in theory, no one is in charge of the blockchain, or you could say everyone is. Which means that if the blockchain is going in a direction which is not ideal or potentially illegal for some practices, then it's really hard to do anything about that. And then potentially there you will need antitrust for tackling those practices and behaviors. So that's the idea. So here indeed, the idea is that blockchain and the law will complement one another. It is not about using software instead of antitrust or using the tech communities instead of governments, but we pretty much believe that the two will actually gain in benefiting from the other. That's again the way we see the field, and of course it will be complex for several reasons. As I said, as lawyers, we've been trained to apply the law no matter what in all circumstances. We also have seen, and that's the famous move fast and break things theory in the Silicon Valley, to put products on the market and then to care about the law. It's not working. So yes, it will be hard to convince those two communities, but we believe that first of all, it's doable, and I'm sure we'll discuss how we can do that. And second of all, it's actually necessary.
And what do you think that some of the implications of this on industry are?
Well, it's a good question. I think we can go back to sort of, first principles here, where Thibault, you've written about this in a previous paper, which was published in the Georgetown Law Technology Review. This, the blockchain is the death of antitrust. Which kind of the title was a nice play on Bork's sort of 78 book, which I thought was quite nice. But one of the arguments that Thibault was talking about there was that the substantive doctrines of antitrust, we can pick up and apply to blockchain use cases. So if we have, for instance, we can have cartel conduct, price fixing, for instance, that might be taking place on a blockchain environment. We could have a case where, say, a blockchain is being used for supply chain management. Well, if we're forcing people to be on that blockchain or else we're not going to deal with them, well, that's a pretty classic kind of exclusive dealing sort of arrangement. It's possible that we could have, say, a huge player in the blockchain development space. We can think of big tech companies that are involved in this space. Well, potentially there might be a misuse of market power if they're trying to squeeze out the little guy, for instance. So we can kind of think of situations where those, I guess, the substantive antitrust can be applied to kind of blockchain situations. I think the problem, and Thibault kind of identifies this in the paper, and it's your paper, Thibault, so I don't want to steal too much of the thunder, but the point that's being made is that, well, it's kind of an enforcement problem. Unless we have an additional identity layer on the top of these blockchain transactions, well, how are we going to know if we've got two competitors or not? How are we going to know if we're dealing with a supplier, producer, wholesaler, retailer kind of relationship? It's not going to be clear unless, one, it's a proprietary blockchain. So I think that's a distinction that can probably be made in this case, is that when we're dealing with a public blockchain, when we're dealing with anonymous transactions, then that's going to be different to a situation where it's a public blockchain. It's kind of licensed access. So I think for me, that's kind of the headline, is that yes, that the law does have an application in this space, but I think it's going to be challenged with an enforcement problem.
Yeah, and to that idea, if I may, so first of all, yes, it's exactly what I wrote in the paper. So there's no.
I agree with it wholeheartedly. So that's yeah. I'm glad you're right.
Good idea, Aaron.
But indeed. So first of all, yes, the title was a bit provocative. I know also that, generally speaking, if you ask a question in the title of a paper, you will answer by the negative, and I'm answering by the positive. So I thought it would be a nice surprise. But the idea was to say, yes, antitrust function. For most practices, they are pretty much the same. Not all of them, but most practices are, about fixing prices and dividing the markets and all that. But indeed, the way I see it is that the problem of enforcement is a big problem, and it is probably underestimated. In the field of antitrust, it is very sexy to talk about the substance, but way less to talk about enforcement and the design of agencies, all of those issues. And I came to the conclusion, and in that way, I'm more on the Lessig side than the Easterbrook side, that you will need regulation so that we can apply antitrust when it is necessary. And if you do not have it, sometimes it will be possible to apply antitrust, but not always. It will be also very, very expensive, meaning that potentially some public agencies could, but if in terms of private litigation, it will be very hard. And so that's why I came to the conclusion that it is the death of antitrust. I'm not saying that we will never be able to apply antitrust to blockchain. What I'm saying is that you will need regulation for antitrust to be applied, meaning that potentially the conversation should and probably will move a bit more to the regulation side than just pure antitrust. And at the end of the paper, I made the analogy, and trust me, it is not, I was sad about that, but I made the analogy with jazz music, explaining that, and I listen to a lot of jazz, so I'm not biased against it. But it is not a subject of conversation in our societies. It is not creating movement. It is not escaping its own field, unfortunately. And potentially the same may be true with antitrust when it comes to blockchain. If what you need is regulation for antitrust to be applied, then this will be the subject and the center of all of our attention, and probably should be. But in that sense, it is the death of antitrust, although yes, it will be applied in one way or the other to blockchain.
I'll just pick up on a couple of threads. I mean, I've endorsed everything that Thibault's had to say so far. So here's some, I guess, some original content. What I think is super interesting is that antitrust is law regulating markets, right? So if we think about this in the Lessig, kind of 4-box framework, we've got one of those boxes being the law trying to regulate and manipulate and control, in a sense, the market structure, and that's got a long history. I know this kind of structured conduct performance paradigm isn't necessarily in vogue everywhere, but that's certainly in Australia, it's been the prevailing kind of theoretical framework for competition policy. And so we can kind of think about the law in that way, about shaping the market. What's interesting, if we bring in our colleagues, Sinclair Davidson, Jason Potts, and Primavera de Filippi, had a paper on the blockchain as a separate economic institution. And so what I find interesting here is that about this discussion is that antitrust has always been about regulating firms in markets. And so the idea of hierarchical control in firms is important for antitrust. The idea of the market definition is really, really important for then assessing whether or not there's been anti-competitive conduct. I think some of what we're talking about here in applying antitrust to blockchains is that we're applying something to a new field of economic organization. The parallel, I guess, or the contrast that I would draw is that we don't apply antitrust to government, right? So government, or the public sector, is another, economic institution that we can organize economic activity through, public services. Historically, the government and the public sector have been completely carved out by antitrust. We simply make them exempt. Now, the exception to that is where they're carrying on a business. So where in Australia, where governments look like markets, where they look like firms participating in markets, we'll apply competition law to them. But in other public services, public hospitals, schools, public broadcasting, whatever you like, the rules don't apply. So I guess my question to pose out there is that, should we be applying antitrust to this new kind of economic institution if it's characterized in that way?
So, I mean, first of all, it's a great paper, also the one that you mentioned. So people out there, please read that paper as well by Primavera and the rest of the team. To me, also, it has been a very influential paper, and it made me think about the fact that, indeed, as you mentioned, antitrust is being applied to firms, and the way we define a firm in antitrust, and that's the same all over the world, is a zone within which there is a vertical control which is being exercised. And in a blockchain, you do not have that vertical control. You certainly have controls between participants in one way or the other, but it is very much a horizontal control, which means that you cannot use the way we've been, qualifying a firm. You cannot put that and transpose that to blockchain, meaning that if you have no firm, then you cannot apply antitrust. So indeed, there is a problem. But to the second part of your question, should we apply antitrust to blockchain? Well, again, that's the idea of our paper with Vitalik. We started from the premise that if indeed blockchain is a third institution, and we could discuss why it is not a firm, or it is not a market, or it is not a government, but if indeed it is becoming the infrastructure on top of which we will build not all, but lots of transactions, and I have the numbers in front of me. Bain estimates that blockchain will be increasing the total number of global trade by $1.1 trillion by 26, which is an increase of 7% of world trade, which is huge. And PwC has even more. They say $1.776 trillion. So if we start from that idea that blockchain will increase global trade by, let's say, 5 to 10%, I think it is necessary to apply antitrust. to those transactions. Because if blockchain are designed in a way which leads towards more coercive economic power, I think in the end, the common good will decrease. So for that reason, indeed, in the paper, we start from the premise that yes, we should apply antitrust, but it doesn't mean that we should apply antitrust without caring about the technology, and the idea that the technology is actually a way also that could be a complement to antitrust, as I has been mentioning.
Yeah, and to that point, I think what Aaron mentioned earlier around permissioned versus permissionless blockchains is a really important distinction. So can we port some of these ideas to other fields? Thibault, I believe you have a keen interest in the sense of the kind of digital economy idea in kind of social media platforms as well. So how do these ideas apply to kind of antitrust in other big tech platforms, and how that could be made kind of more accountable and more transparent?
Yes, sure. So I think indeed there is a distinction here I like to make between big tech companies using blockchain to change their service. And I also wrote a short paper about Libra, which is a good example of Facebook creating its own cryptocurrency. Whether or not it is a permissionless blockchain or permission blockchain, we could discuss for a long time, I guess. But I think it's one field. And the other is how blockchain could actually potentially disrupt parts of big tech markets. To the first, I think what will be very interesting is to think of it in terms of layers. And if indeed, to some degree, you could actually see how some blockchain communities to grow or to put a great service on the market or a great product will need to access something that is being detained by big tech companies, then potentially it will be very, very interesting to study whether or not those tech companies are abusing their power to prevent blockchain in a certain way. So that's one. And so again, that idea of layer, I think is very interesting there. And for the other, which is blockchain disrupting big tech companies, I think to some degree, and I know it has been very powerful, especially in the US in the 90s, a bit less, but it's coming back in Europe. The idea of network effect, I think, is the very center of lots and lots of or let's call it computational cases. And the idea behind it is to say, well, should you want to create a competitor to Facebook, something very similar? First of all, it will be very hard, but even if you were to succeed, it would mean that for some years, you will get just a few users, and before you can reach the tipping point where lots of users start to join the service, Facebook will have the time by then to actually find a way to put you out of the market. And for that reason, the suspicion is that big tech companies have monopoly power, which are close to actually natural monopolies. And I think potentially with blockchain, that could change and the paradigm could shift a little bit. The idea is that if indeed you create a blockchain, let's say on top of which you want to build a social media, as you mentioned, what you can do is that you can release a token on the market, and that way you can create an incentive for users to join your blockchain and use your service, although there is no utility for them to do so. If there are only 100 users on the social media, what would you join? I mean, unless those users are all your friends and family, but otherwise there is no reason why you would join. But a good reason is that if you want to take the token and hope that the token will one day become valuable, well, potentially there you create a decorrelation between the willingness to join the network and the utility to join the network. And that, I think, is very interesting. I think that explains why we see what has been called serial monopolies within the blockchain field. You know, with those blockchains we hear every two days, oh, that's the new Bitcoin, that's the new Ethereum. And yes, indeed, they got lots of users, but they disappear also very quickly. And that, I think, is very interesting in terms of competition policy. If you think of it in terms of blockchain versus big tech, and if you look at the reason why, the number one reason why some people are not using big tech services, let me take Facebook, or it could be Twitter or another social media as an example. They say, and we have lots of survey, they say that the reason why they are not using those services is because of the trust issue. They do not trust Facebook or Twitter or any other social media with the way they handle the data and so on. And so with blockchain, potentially that is much different, right? Because again, there is no pilot in the cockpit, certainly not for a public permissionless blockchain. So that's another argument why blockchain could potentially compete with big tech. Now, to the question, is blockchain about to replace big tech? I do not believe that. I believe that it could be valuable in certain situations or for certain services to have a pilot in the cockpit. Because indeed you could change the design, you could move the social media in a way overnight, which is hard within a blockchain ecosystem. But for some other things, blockchain could be valuable and valued by consumers. So at the end of the day, there is a possibility, I'm not saying this will happen, but there is a possibility that blockchain may disrupt big tech to some degree. And I think that is interesting to competition agencies, which will mean that part of their objective, if not the number one objective, should be to protect blockchain or to make sure that it could actually disrupt the market if possible, instead of trying to just tackle big tech and to recreate competition within the big tech ecosystem. While potentially it will be worth investigating how we could actually help the blockchain ecosystem to emerge and to compete with it. For that reason, I was very pleased to see that the DOJ in the US has been investigating that idea. And I quote, Makander Rahim said that it is vital for antitrust enforcers to understand how the emerging technology works, here mentioning blockchain, and how it can impact competition. And indeed, it means that antitrust agencies should probably see how they could make sure that market alternatives emerge instead of just, taking care of tackling what exists already.
Yeah, and it's that true idea from very early around creating alternatives, which the blockchain kind of provides in this example. Aaron, do you have further thoughts on how government plays into that picture as well? I mean, I'm not sure how closely you've been kind of tracking the Section 230 stuff in the US or even the US elections, but a lot of the conversation around the power and kind of dominance of big tech platforms have this contradiction really around that government is dependent on them as a political platform as well as wanting to regulate them.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole minefield of issues there. And I guess as you've hinted to, it's been a massive political issue in the United States where both sides of the aisle are kind of hating on big tech, but for very different reasons. The Republican Party are kind of hating on the fact that they're being perceived as being censored, where you've got the political left and the Democrats are sort of hating on big tech for not censoring enough. So, that's probably a big oversimplification of the political problem, but that's kind of how I saw the most recent kind of grillings of the various CEOs. Look, I don't know where that will go, but I will make this reflection, is that we kind of haven't really dealt with two-sided markets in antitrust. And what I mean by not dealt with is that we don't have a high degree of consensus about how to treat, two-sided markets. So when we've got these social media companies that are effectively matching kind of consumers on one side with these profiles, and they get to use the services effectively for a zero price. And Thibault's mentioned the network effect of that. On the other side, you've got kind of the advertisers that want the data. I guess the most prominent two-sided market antitrust case in the United States was the case of Ohio and American Express. Now, the Supreme Court was really divided on that outcome. It's a complicated kind of case on transaction fees. So let's not go into that subject. That's kind of not totally relevant to our conversation here. But my point is this: with the blockchain, what we're seeing is a three-sided market. We've got users, we've got miners, and we've got developers as well. And so I just think if the antitrust kind of community has no consensus around two-sided market jurisprudence, how on earth are we going to come to any sort of consensus around a 3 market? You got kind of analysis. So I can see, again, when we mentioned this earlier, some of the substantive law doctrines, being able to apply it to different situations, I kind of get that. But what happens when we add a bit more complexity into those hypothetical cases? I think it's just a bit of a minefield. I'm deeply skeptical that we're going to come out of that with any rational kind of doctrine. So what are the implications for that? Well, that kind of suggests to me that, that this idea of kind of coding in kind of antitrust constraints is probably a more fruitful way to go than traditionally what we've seen is law being discovered by the adversarial system. Or maybe we need, antitrust law to be discovered by the coders instead.
Yeah, may I say something regarding those? Because I think indeed, it's key to the way we've been tackling big tech and also to some degree for blockchain. So the American Express case that you mentioned, indeed, we're not going into detail, but basically the Supreme Court was divided between the idea that there will be transaction or non-transaction platforms. The idea being that transaction platforms, the two sides of the platform, will interact with one another directly, and non-transaction, they will interact through the platform in the middle. And to some degree, I think that distinction makes sense. But there is another one, and here I very much agree with you, is that we have no consensus yet, and that other theory has not been discussed in the field of antitrust yet, although I think it is also important. And here's the distinction between an aggregator and a platform. To some degree, you could say that some are aggregator, which means that they take existing informations out there and they'd actually condense that information and put it in a convenient way to consumers. And platforms are different. Platform could be used to build something on top of it, which has totally different implications for antitrust, especially when it comes to choice. And so again, yes, we do not have any consensus there. And to some degree, at least the way I see it, is that we have no choice but to understand code. And if we don't do that, if we do not dive into the way we program platforms, aggregators, or non-transaction platforms, anything you want, we will never reach the consensus. In a way, I feel sometimes as if we were looking at all that from above without, really trying to understand. And to some degree, we're going to have to do that. And yet, if you look at all the cases against big tech and the few cases in the case of blockchain, it's not about code. It's about contractual relationships, because that we understand very easily. But to some degree, it creates a legal loophole where we say, if you want to do something illegal, do it within the code, because antitrust agencies won't go there. And indeed, if they don't go there, we don't increase our understanding of those markets. So I think that's one. And the second thing that you also mentioned, Aaron, is that, well, yes, the adversarial system is not perfect, and potentially it won't be enough. And yet I believe that if we get rid of it, as the European Commission is willing to do apparently with the Digital Service Act and the new competition tool, where we will totally circumvent all of those and the trials and all that towards more ex-ante regulation, I believe that if we do that and take that road, we will not increase our understanding of big tech and blockchain and what's coming next, quantum computing, and the combination of all that taking all together. So again, it's a call in a sense. And understanding code, by the way, doesn't mean that you have to learn how to code in Python in a week. You have services and tools, and we've been hearing about the GTP3, the new technology out there, where you can actually give a piece of code, and that AI will actually translate what it means in our plain languages. And I think that could be a way, right, to use tech to better understand tech. And in the field of antitrust, I believe that we need to do that.
Yeah, and so I guess just riffing off that, something that we need for that adversarial system is people that understand this, and that's advocates, that's expert witnesses that will be able to to come to court and present that in a digestible manner. That's the judiciary being educated about some of these, technology issues as well. So yeah, I think there's definitely a wider kind of education piece around that. And I know Thibault is doing this. Certainly RMIT are doing this around integrating blockchain into courses, into our law schools, into our business programs, for this exact reason, it's because we want more people to understand kind of these issues. But just to get back to, some of the big tech debates, I think it's important to separate out, I guess, some of the economic problems that we're seeing and the role that antitrust might play there from perhaps some of the more social problems. And because there is this school of thought that they call themselves, I think, the neo-Brandisians. I would call them the antitrust hipsters that see antitrust as a tool for not just the economic power, but the democratic power that they might have, or the social power, or and tackling things like inequality and those sorts of things, rather than strictly kind of competition issues. And so I think that's kind of simmering away in the background. And I think we can see some of those issues in Australia with the digital platforms inquiry and some of the codes that are coming out of those that are going to apply to Google and Facebook and others. It's not necessarily this is not competition policy being applied in the normal sense. This is competition policy being applied to try and get some other sort of, social outcome. And so I'm not sure that has a big relevance for blockchain. What might be interesting though is if we see over time, that there's clear kind of dominant players in the blockchain space. We kind of already see that with, in payments, so Bitcoin, the Bitcoin blockchain far outstrips any other payment platform. I think Ethereum are kind of being set up, for smart contracts and other sort of functionality. Will we see that be the dominant player there? Will there be a proprietary blockchain that is dominant? That's kind of something I'm thinking about. Is okay, in that sense, if that becomes the infrastructure, the public infrastructure, if you like, in this community, will we start to see bottleneck and access issues potentially on the top of that? And what's the parallel? Because in the real world, I guess the physical world, we have these access regimes where, the government is kind of involved in facilitating access to significant infrastructure. I'm not sure there's a parallel in the digital space.
Well, I mean, to that, potentially it will be very interesting also to make a distinction between, let's say, one blockchain, a public blockchain, is saying now to access the blockchain, you have to meet certain criteria, so it's not really public anymore. It will be interesting to see if the entire community were in favor of those changes, or if just part of the community managed to implement those changes in a way which could be anti-competitive. But in the first situation, should we apply antitrust? I mean, there it will be actually not only a technical issue, but a philosophical issue, right? It will be, in a sense, the old world, which is vertical with all of our agencies and governments, versus a decentralized communities, which may agree to do something and go in a direction where most, if not all of the users agree to that. And again, it's one layer of complexity, right? Another one, which is here, the philosophy and the social aspect of all that behind it.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, Aaron, that you've raised in terms of, I mean, partly the governance, as Thibault has responded, but also, I guess it's really a question around what's the world you're trying to paint? Like, we've spoken about transparency, accountability, and the public good, but what does that actually look like? And I'm curious on both of your reflections, given your experience in academia and education, but also industry, in terms of how is that education piece going into how are we going in terms of getting there, of educating the lawyers, but also, as Aaron suggested earlier, is it coders learning antitrust as well?
Well, for me, I would say that I'm, generally speaking, quite happy about the direction where we're going. I think I was very skeptic 2-3 years ago, and I thought, well, big issues, big opportunities, right? We've been discussing that, but also big issues are coming, and I'm not sure if antitrust agencies and law school and practicing lawyers will actually be willing to tackle those issues. And yes, this could be complex to a certain degree, but so is the internet. At the end of the day, all of the protocols, on top of which we build the internet are complex. And yet we all discuss and understand what are the implications of the internet on our society. The same is true for blockchain. When it comes to agencies, there are several agencies which have been pretty active in the field, including France, in the United States, in Sweden. We have a few cases, I think one case recently in Peru, in Portugal. So yes, I see that blockchain and decentralized communities are gaining interest there. In terms of law school, well, of course, it's hard to have a big perspective, but I can see that with my students, they are very engaged and really happy to learn about blockchain. And then, I teach a small course, and then some of them want to write their master's thesis on the subject. And then a few of my students now applied to work in the field. So I can see interest there, and I think it's great. And there are a few websites here and there who've listed all of the universities offering blockchain courses, and it is definitely increasing exponentially. So to some degree, I think we are going in the right direction. I also appreciate the willingness not to disturb or potentially destroy the blockchain ecosystem, with some regulations that we will not really understand. And to some degree, I think we've been pretty careful, at least so far, in trying to regulate blockchain. And by the way, the community is asking for those regulations because it increased legal certainty, and that's great. But also at the same time, not to get rid of the core characteristics of a blockchain. To some degree, I think the European Commission regulation, at least the draft that has been published at the end of September on the markets in crypto assets regulation, potentially is very much welcomed and necessary. So yes, that's a positive message I like to send out there, and kudos to everyone engaged in the field, I guess.
Aaron, on that?
Yeah, look, I think I can only sort of speak again for my own students, but the sense that I get is that, there's kind of two types of students. There's those that are really, really interested and engaged in it, and, quickly develop, quite a high understanding of these topics. And then there are probably this other group of students who are probably approaching it a bit more cautiously, saying, yeah, I've heard about this, but it sounds really, really complex. And, I don't think I'm quite smart enough almost to understand it. And what I say to them is I sort of borrow a line from our colleague Sinclair Davidson, who says, you don't have to understand how your mobile phone works in order to understand the legal and economic significance of what the mobile phone does. And I think it's exactly the same as an introduction into the blockchain space, to say, you don't have to understand, how to code. You don't have to understand all the underlying protocols, but you can still grasp the fundamentals to understand the legal significance of that. And I think students have been really, really receptive to that. And I think the other thing is just thinking about how it's taught. So there are kind of two schools of thought out there about how to teach kind of law and blockchain, and part of that is, all lawyers need to do kind of a 46 months of coding. And the other side, kind of, I guess, is my preference. It says, no, we can kind of teach the legal principles and how it might apply, and start from a first principles kind of an approach. And that's been my preference. I'm not saying it's the only one, but it's certainly my preference. And I think we're getting good results from that. The RMIT's undergraduate law degree, which is launching next year, so a plug for that, is really technology focused, and we're doing that in a way in embedding technology throughout every course, rather than just kind of one unit or 2 units on on technology. It's trying to embed these things, right throughout. So it's not a law of the horse approach. It's more kind of trying to integrate that in a holistic way.
The term glossolalia keeps coming to my mind, but I'll leave that for now. Thibault, I'll let you speak, and I just wanted to thank each of you. I think you've both provided a really great taster today on these concepts of blockchain and antitrust law, and also referred to so many great resources, which we'll go back and write down in some show notes. But curious what each of you are both working on now or next.
Yes, sure. And to just say something about the subjects of our students and the education, I think, and I very much agree. I mean, at least for me, I've taken also the second perspective, and there are some tools out there that allows you not to design your own blockchain, because that's not necessary, but to use some of the applications and to see the way it functions and understand that way blockchain core characteristics. You can now have the app on your phone, Android or the iOS, to download the MetaMask and to try using some applications without spending any real money out there. So that's what I'm trying to do in the classroom. And to some degree, again, I fully agree with you. I mean, it's not about being smart at all. It's about, the willingness just to put some time in understanding the ecosystem, which at the end of the day, sure, could be very complex, but also the basics and the fundamentals are not that complex. But so in terms of what I'm doing right now, and I guess to some degree, it also complements part of my answer, I'm becoming more and more interested in how antitrust agencies and governments, generally speaking, could also use technologies to better tackle challenges, to improve their processes and analysis. And it could be blockchain, it could be AI, and some others. But to some degree, I believe that it could be, first of all, a way to improve our legal system, to increase the common good that way, but also probably a way to convince here antitrust agencies that blockchain is a crucial technology. It's also very interesting. And if they get to use it to improve the way they function, potentially it could be one way then to enter the field and to better tackle the challenges in the coming future. So that has been part of what I'm writing about and researching here. And again, to some degree, I very much believe that we have to stop to take the full confrontational approach between the law and the technology, and they could become allied to one another. And it's not because we have some bad experiences with big tech companies or startup or whatever that we have to reproduce everything once again. So here again is a positive message from Utrecht.
Fascinating, and I think we'll have to have you on another episode to talk about some of those other technologies, if without overemphasizing blockchain as just the transaction layer, but would love to hear more about how you see sort of AI and some of these other tools interacting and playing out. Aaron?
Well, Kelsie, I'm working on two books. One is an edited collection of sort of essays around DAOs. The other one is more of kind of a law and digital business sort of piece. So we'll be looking at antitrust in that context. I'm writing that with my co-author Pip Ryan, who is at ANU. So she's written a lot in the blockchain space as well. So we've sort of joined forces to do something around that, to take a kind of a more broader lens. So not just antitrust, but privacy, cybercrime, the list goes on. So it's going to be fun to write.
Yeah, and I've heard some of your research sort of processes around blockchain and crime, which have been very interesting. And DAOs, in the context that you mentioned there, refers to decentralized autonomous organizations, which is another thing to add to the lengthy but worthwhile blockchain glossary. So I'll pause the conversation here, because I would love to keep in touch with both of you and continue at some point. But thank you to our guests Thibault Schrepel and Aaron Lane, and thank you for joining us for this episode of Mint and Burn. You can check out the show notes and get in touch if you have ideas or feedback on the podcast. And if you're interested in more information and further research, visit rmitblockchain.io. Thanks very much.